Hi, my name is Chris and I'm a postdoc and associated member of ML4Q, and you're listening to ML4Q&A, a show where members from the Matter and Light for Quantum Computer cluster answer questions about their work in the cluster, their research and the future of quantum. Today we talk with Jan Klos about going from a master project in simulating quantum dot spin qubits to a PhD project fabricating them. We also discuss outreach, student supervision, thesis writing and Sauerbraten. It is my pleasure to welcome Jan Klos in the podcast. He's a PhD student in the group of Hendrik Bluhm, working on quantum dot spin qubits. So how did you get into this? You studied in Aachen, right?
Yeah. So hi, yeah. Nice having me here. I studied in Aachen. I came here after my military service and my A levels, and decided to study physics here. Yeah.
And of course, then you start studying, and I think it's weird, right? In the first few years of the physics studies, you get to see a little bit of everything, and you just get exposed to the general physics theory.
Pretty much, yeah.
But then in the bachelor comes the first point where you sort of can, first of all, start a project with a group, but also a little bit decide what kind of physics, or like take a first step in a specialization, right?
Yeah, in the very end of the bachelor's.
Yeah. So what did you do for a bachelor end project?
So for my thesis in the very end, I ended up at the Fraunhofer Institute for Laser Technology, and then focusing basically on a medicine part where we use the laser to actually detect individual molecules to have some kind of cell sorter in the end. So it was very much experimental work where you basically had to combine multiple different disciplines like optics and a little bit of biotechnology in this case to actually end up then with the final thesis.
So that's like a very versatile bachelor end project, I guess. Because
pretty much.
It's very nice. And then you continued with the master, and I guess at that point you slowly gravitated towards quantum information, or was it even before?
Yeah. So after my bachelor's, I basically decided to study theoretical physics, and there I had a choice between particle physics and solid state physics in this case, and I decided to go for solid state. And then I became aware, step by step, basically, of quantum information and especially quantum computing. And at some point, I also found the group of Professor Hendrik Bluhm, who was actually the only group literally focusing on an experimental approach of quantum technologies here, or quantum computing using spin qubits in this case. And that's why I ended up in this group.
So how important were the early on courses for this? Like, I also studied in Aachen accidentally. And for me, definitely the both a theoretical course and there was also an experimental course on quantum technologies and quantum computing. And for me, this was really important. How was this for you?
Let's say it like that. The theoretical lectures, they were interesting, but not necessarily always related to what I'm doing now, and especially not to quantum computing as the main focus now. Still, I learned during that time that independently of what kind of problem you're dealing with, you can somehow you learn how to solve a problem. And in this case, I'm not scared of anything nonlinear anymore or anything very abstract. And this is basically something I took away from the theoretical masters. In terms of what I really learned during my master's lectures for now was basically that I back then already took several classes which focused on nanoelectronics and also quantum information in this case. This basically was the foundation of everything which came beyond or afterwards.
So joining the group of Hendrik Bluhm for the Master End project was quite a logical step in that case.
Kind of, yeah.
Yeah, because it brought together the electronics and quantum information, and a bit of materials.
So I always had basically, I normally develop some kind of idea where I want to go, and then subsequently take the steps towards this goal. So it was basically clear that I wanted to have something in the semiconductor range or semiconductor research, quantum computing and quantum information was already quite a hot topic. And therefore, I already decided quite early that I want to do something like this or in this research field. And therefore, it was a logical step, even though I knew that I wanted to do this beforehand.
Was it that you picked among different possible projects and you picked one project that caught your eye? Or was it that you maybe went to meet with Hendrik or the group and discussed what could be possible for a master's project?
Well, I knew that depending on the actual availability of samples or measurements which are feasible during a 1 year's master thesis, I knew that I rather wanted to do something with simulation where I know that the actual limitation is myself rather than something which is beyond my possibilities in this case, which I can influence, for example. And therefore, I directly approached, in this case, Dr. Lars Schreiber, who's basically a subgroup leader here, and asked him, and then we simply discussed what kind of possibilities there are. And then I directly started simulating in this case.
And so the thing that you simulated was, so you did simulations related to what electrons do in these materials, right? In a rough sense, like
yeah, in a rough sense. So the problem is always that we often have an idea of an experiment, right? And let's say that we want to localize a single electron to form a qubit out of it, but to do so we need some kind of specific sample. And obviously, you cannot directly know in advance how this kind of sample should look like. So what kind of layout we need. And therefore, we often start with basically simulations to actually have a first proof of principle that whatever we are thinking of or we are imagining actually can work in the very end. And so this is basically then a pre-characterization, if you say so.
Yeah, exactly. Let's maybe take a step back. So if you want to build a quantum computer, you want to make a qubit. And the qubit is something that can be either 0 or 1 or up or down. And
it's for example, that you say up or down. Yep.
Yeah. And for example, you can have the spin, right? The spin is a qubit. Now, unfortunately, these spins usually have electrons attached to them, right? So in order to have a spin, you can catch an electron and put it somewhere.
Exactly. So we are basically localizing a single electron, and the rotation momentum in this case is what we call a spin, right? And then we manipulate a single individual electron in terms of the spin state. So whether it's, as you said, pointing up or down or left or right, it doesn't really matter as long as we have two dedicated levels or two dedicated directions. And that's what we use as a spin on a very microscopic scale in comparison to different approaches.
So this trap for an electron is a quantum dot. And so if you have multiple quantum dots, if you want to build more of them, you basically have these trapped electrons, and they can maybe see each other a little bit.
If you want them to, yes.
If you want them to.
So you can always imagine that we are forming something like a small bucket, right? And this kind of bucket is then later on, if it works out, filled with a single electron and within 2 degrees of, or with a spin, which is either pointing up or down. And then since we want to have multiple quantum dots or multiple spin qubits in this case, we simply form a second bucket right next to it. And then it depends basically on the surrounding of this bucket, whether they can see each other or not, right?
Yeah. And so the simulations that you started the simulation project, and one of the things is that the electrons are already confined to live in a 2D plane, right? Like that's usually the starting point. And then you have an additional layer to confine them within this 2D plane.
Exactly.
Where did your simulations come in at that point?
So, as you said, our electrons live in we call it 2-dimensional electron gas, which basically means that as soon as we have enough electrons everywhere, because we did something very clever in the end, we have multiple electrons within this plane. And the idea is now that we fabricate electrodes on top of this kind of heterostructure, which is actually forming or builds the sample basis. And then by applying negative voltages, which actually repel electrons, which are negatively charged, we can actually form or structure this kind of two-dimensional electron gas. And with the specific arrangement of these electrodes on top, and by applying suitable voltages, we can end up with a single individually controlled electron at a specific location. And to actually know now how you have to fabricate or how this kind of electrode structure should look like, we use simulations to do this in advance, because otherwise it would be a huge amount of work which simply might not work in the end.
Yeah. And one of the difficulties is, I guess, that the structures are very small, right?
Yeah, we're talking about like 30 nanometers in width. Yeah. Length can be larger, right? But the scale size is always tens of nanometers.
And how detailed are these kinds of simulations, and how good do they match with the real thing?
Interesting question. So at the beginning, I thought, simulation is key. If you simulate, you definitely get the perfect result, and you know exactly what's going to happen. In terms of how it actually turns out in an experiment, this is different, because simulations obviously always rely on some kind of assumptions which are ideal. In an experiment, this is not necessarily the case. If we come back to your question and say, okay, depending on the length scale or the width of a gate, there the influence is not as large, because if we have like 30 nanometers and we vary it by a few nanometers, in percentage-wise, this doesn't really make a big difference. But as soon as you consider, for example, all the different materials you have in your simulation and in your sample, in the very end, it will be completely different. And then at some point, we also decided to incorporate, we call it disorder. So basically everything which distorts our simulations from the ideal case. And we started to actually run first simulations with that. And then it's different. So it's a completely different story as soon as you go away, obviously, from the ideal case. And then you have to find better approximations to actually fulfill this.
So when you say, 30 nanometers, that's something like 300 atoms, or, like not super many atoms.
Yeah.
So at that point, if you have like a few atoms out of place, that makes a big difference, right? Like if you have a wrong atom somewhere or an atom missing.
So not necessarily on the scale of the electrodes on top.
Yeah.
This is not a problem. It can be a little bit wider, a little bit more narrow. That doesn't really make a big difference. It becomes problematic, not on a physical side, but from a technological point of view, that if you have too small electrodes and they simply are not connected anymore, because you have like a very strong variation in terms of the width, which can also drop to zero, obviously, and then your electrode doesn't work anymore. So this is rather a technological problem you have to solve, but not necessarily directly a physical problem, which ends up changing the tunability of your qubits, for example.
My question is, if you add imperfections, do you rather add a few defects into your simulation, which are like discrete points, or is it that you sort of make a parameter very continuously? Like, do you say, this parameter is like 5.5 instead of 5.7, or is it rather that you say at this specific point there's a piece of crap and it distorts everything?
So we are doing both. The one thing is that depending on what kind of disorder you're looking for, you, for example, have a very valid approximation that you simply take a charged defect, so point defect somewhere in some kind of material layer, let's say an oxide or a dielectric in general. And on the other hand, the other way is basically that you systematically change a specific parameter within your simulation, which then ends up being dominantly or dominantly influencing your results. But this is basically something you can counteract up to some degree. But these kind of defects, which are sitting at a specific point, this is basically the biggest seems to yield the biggest contribution in terms of variability, which we see in our samples in the very end. And to counteract this, we always try to go towards ensembles. So let's say 100, 200, 500 different simulations with randomly distributed point defects to actually then end up with a solid and statistically valid outcome in the end to actually say how this relates and changes our qubit parameters.
So basically in your master thesis, you could start to understand on the one hand, what is the thing that you need to make work in order to make working devices? Like what is the biggest problem? But on the other hand, maybe also come up with designs that are a bit more robust to this problem.
Yeah, this was basically the very first steps towards this direction. Obviously, this kind of evolution you just described changed or evolved over multiple years. And this is basically a big focus of our group, that we are trying to make it more and more realistic.
And so these simulations are very close to theoretical physics. Did you enjoy the theory part, or how, is it something you like? If you, now, I guess you do your PhD in experimental physics, so I can ask you, like, there's the theory of like looking at a problem, trying to understand it better, trying to figure it out abstractly. There's experiment, which is
hands-on.
So what do you enjoy more?
I always felt that theory can be sometimes pretty dry and time-consuming. Obviously, there are people who can really enjoy this, and I have biggest respect to these guys who actually also bring the field forward. But at some point, I always wanted to be a little bit more hands-on to for example, have at some point a sample in my hand, saying, okay, I built this, for example. Or I have now something where I can actually have not problems on a piece of paper or on the whiteboard I have to solve, but rather something a little bit larger and more physical, let's say.
So I mean, also since Big Bang Theory, we know that there's these two kinds of physicists.
I studied during the time when the series came out. Yeah, that was
do you
fun.
feel like I've always also felt weird about this? Do you feel that we have to distinguish in experiment and theory, or is it possible to do both to some extent? Should we all try to do a bit more of both? Like, what do you think?
Obviously, there are research fields which are only experimental and completely uninteresting for theory, and the other way around. For quantum information, quantum computing, I would definitely say that we have to work together as close as possible. Because as soon as you go a little bit beyond simply clicking individual or not clicking buttons, but tuning a qubit, you have to understand the theory behind it. Right, we are at the moment we have like one big project which is focusing on transporting a qubit coherently over a specific distance. As soon as you do this in experiment, it might seem easy because it might seem, but as soon as you go into theory, you will realize that there are so many implications to this which have to be understood in the very end. And therefore, you need also hardcore theory guys to investigate this even further.
I think both things happen, right? Sometimes we just try to do something experimentally, and then 2 years later, somebody does some back of the envelope calculation and tells us that this was never even possible. It can happen.
It can happen.
And sometimes things work in experiment, and theorists come later and understand why. And sometimes theorists make, it also occasionally happens that a theorist makes a proposal and it just works. Although that's maybe...
I would say it's more bound to particle physics, but it always takes like decades to actually prove that. But yeah, it happens.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, the spin qubit proposal was done by David DiVincenzo, and this was in 1998, right? And we're still working hard to sort of see this architecture really work in a big multi-qubit setup.
Yeah, the scaling is especially the problem, right? Individual spin qubits have been proven to work. Not all of them are perfect. One has to be that honest, but it's still a long way to go in this case.
So, but at any rate, you came with a solid theoretical understanding out of your master's project, and then, I mean, you knew what you were getting into, and you decided to continue with the PhD. Yeah. But you sort of slightly changed direction. Can you describe how, like, you went into your PhD project and?
So during my master's, I was predominantly sitting in front of my desktop PC simulating. After like 1 year of simulating and sitting in your office, while everybody else in your experimental group is going to the lab and going to the clean room and doing stuff and, I don't know, ordering cables, whatever they did. I felt the urge to also be more hands-on, even more hands-on, obviously. And then a good colleague of mine offered me the possibility to actually join him one day in a clean room in Jülich. So basically the research center. And there I actually decided that going into the technology side to actually create a single sample, starting from scratch with, let's say, a piece of silicon and turning it into something which can be a qubit in the very end, is something I wanted to do. This is basically the completely opposite part from what I've done before. But it was somehow the way I wanted to do things and dive deeper into semiconductor, in this case, then technology. Yeah. And we had this kind of cool project I now work on, which actually focused then on re-evaluating the technology we use to fabricate these kind of samples, in the sense that we wanted to use ideas which already are implemented in industry to use them to fabricate one of our samples. And this was basically then the holy grail of combining more hands-on work, working in a clean room, and diving deeper into technology which is used in semiconductor industry in this case.
Yeah, exactly. This is like one of the big sales points for semiconductor quantum dots, and especially silicon semiconductor quantum dots.
Yeah, silicon is...
That people always say that silicon is what computers are made of.
It's correct. I mean, it's true, right?
It is true, yes.
Obviously, there are always the details which are the most important, and which actually then later on make a difference. But yeah,
so
still.
Let's just talk a little bit about materials, maybe at the example of silicon and gallium arsenide, because it's, to be honest, gallium arsenide is a similarly perfected, if not more perfected material than silicon, right?
Well, so as far as I know, gallium arsenide, in terms of the materials and the heterostructures or substrates we use, is only as perfect in quotation marks as it is because there was the laser industry behind it, because they actually needed gallium arsenide to fabricate better lasers, so they had to improve this kind of quality.
So it's a very good material, yeah.
It is, from a quality point of view, good. For qubits later on, not necessarily.
Yes, right? Exactly.
And the problem is always that, I mean, what you want to do with the few qubits. And if you want to scale this up in terms of that you basically get like 100, 1,000 and so on and so forth, you should better use a material system which is somewhat capable of being fabricated by somebody else than an academic group. Because this is basically the way to go. If you do research in academia, in the best case, you want to transfer this kind of knowledge which was made or generated into industry. That's how it normally works. And gallium arsenide is not known to be a material system which is handled by industry, at least not the industry which is actually focusing on fabricating field effect transistors.
So what's the other important difference between gallium arsenide and silicon in terms of making spin qubits?
Well, silicon itself is... So I wouldn't always say that there is advantages or disadvantages, or there are disadvantages and advantages in this case. It's very hard to compare these because they are very different, right? For gallium arsenide, you have to deal with nuclear spins, which are on an atomistic order. For silicon, you don't have to do this in this extent, but you get different problems, right? One important one, or one famous one, maybe famous in our community, is the so-called Welle splitting in silicon, which you have to somehow counteract, or at least work with it, what we are doing. So I wouldn't directly say that there are big differences, but in comparison to gallium arsenide, silicon still has the possibility to actually build on knowledge which has been already generated in different fields.
Yeah. So the idea of your project was basically to work on a new way of fabricating, right? Mm-hmm. And bring in this sort of silicon expertise from industry.
Exactly.
Can you quickly, like for in layman's terms, give an idea of what's the difference between how academic silicon works compared to industry silicon?
To break this down, you're trying to make the fabrication in terms of technology to end up with the qubit sample as self-reliant as possible, let's say. In academia, our traditional way is that we fabricate small electrodes by a so-called lift-off process, which is carried out. Let's say it works like this. And then you repeat this kind of step 3 times. Let's say it tops 3 times. And you have to make sure that every single iteration is aligned. And since we already discussed the width of such a gate is like on a scale of like 30 nanometers, and you want to have them aligned on a scale of like 5 nanometers. Aligning something on a scale of 5 nanometers is hard. So there are a few people who can do this, but this is really, really hard. And the problem is that you do this 3 times in iterations. You also have all the time a different kind of topography because you're basically putting them onto each other every single iteration. So it gets increasingly complicated. And the idea was then that we use a process, in this case, from industry silicon, which is so-called self-aligned, which means that you do not really have to care for alignment anymore. It also yields a single or no topography with increasing step size. You can also do this multiple times and end up always with smaller footprints, or width in this case of the electrons, but the topography does not increase. And if you have the possibility to actually run this in a dedicated set of tools or technology in this case, you also have a higher yield in the end because the variability does not necessarily increase as long as these different steps which you repeat are well processed or well developed. Which is a completely different story if you go to increasing topography and putting things onto each other. Imagine building a house on a house, and then it gets more and more worse instead of building a skyscraper, for example.
So for this, you had partners from you needed a partner group to the Aachen Research Group, right?
Exactly. So. This overall project is basically a collaboration between our Physics Institute and the Institute of Semiconductor Technology, also at RWTH. And their focus is predominantly on CMOS technology and fabricating MOSFETs, and obviously more than MOSFETs, but MOSFETs is one big part. And there we started this kind of collaboration with. And so I ended up in a clean room, also learning from them, developing own processes and so on, and also bringing in a little bit of let's say, physics touch to simply process development.
So did you enjoy being at this interface between physics and engineering and working with the
I still do.
Oh yeah.
I still do. After all these years, I still do. I also think that especially all these interfaces between different groups where it's very hard to communicate because they, for example, speak different languages. This is basically always one of the biggest problems, independent of what you do. So being at the interface is always fun.
I also always, whenever I work with some electrical engineering experts, I often have the impression that there's many problems that the engineers are really, really good at solving. Like for example, if you do controls on qubits, the signal level, like the signal processing and these things, there's many things that we can still probably learn from.
Yeah, definitely.
So that's a great place to be for the PhD, right?
But the biggest problem is always that you at the very beginning have to learn to understand what they're aiming at and what they're interested in, because otherwise, if I start talking about T1 times and spin qubits and so on, they're always like, okay, what does this mean in terms of a MOSFET? What about the subthreshold slope if I want to increase or accumulate electrons? And this is like this is really this is something one has to learn at a bit.
So exactly, let's talk a little bit about this. So you need to have an idea of building a device on a chip, or ideally many copies of a device, and coming up with sort of the good device for testing the figure of merit that you want. Let's say you want a semiconductor that is a quiet electrical environment where your electron is happy. What is the ideal device? Do you build quantum dots, or do you build what is the first device that you build to characterize a material? And the process, like not only a material, but like the whole.
So at the moment so there are like obviously different steps you have to take until you end up hopefully in the end with a qubit. And one of the most basic steps is that you accumulate a current or electrons and have low temperature ohmic contacts. This is so fundamental that most of the people don't really think about this anymore, and especially not that something could go wrong with this. Right? This is something one has to relearn from time to time, but this is also the part which is the most overlapping with, for example, the MOSFET guys, right? You're always, at the very beginning, you have to have contact to whatever sample you have. And from this, you can proceed then. Next step would be to, for example, form or fabricate a so-called Hall bar, which allows you to later on infer the mobility, so somewhat limited by scattering effects and remote scattering and defects and so on, or versus then the actual density of electrons you can accumulate. That's then the second part. And then you sequentially improve and increase whatever you're interested in.
So the engineers, they also build Hall bars, right? Probably, yeah. They should. But then the next step would be maybe a quantum point contact or quantum dot, which they don't do?
Yeah, well, so first of all, most of the times the electrical or guys in the MOSFET community do not necessarily cool their samples down. So they are more interested in like hot devices on a scale of like way above millikelvin regime, and this obviously also already makes a difference. But yeah, it's somewhat related, but the differences are already there, obviously, right? So temperature regime does play a role, but so as soon as we are forming a QPC, for example, to try to pinch off this current we just induced, this is pretty much related to having a MOSFET which is simply switched off.
Yeah, exactly. Like this quantum point contact is like a minimum electrical connection, so to speak.
MOSFET type. Yeah, but yeah, the overall regime is completely different, right?
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, we could also try to cool down a MOSFET, but the question is then when.
So where did you guys start with these devices?
What do you mean? Where do we start?
Like when you started out collaborating with a semiconductor community. what were the first devices that you guys built, and were you like immediately happy, or did you from the onset?
You mean within this project?
Yes.
Basically, yeah. So I started with a piece of silicon. So literally at the very beginning, okay, one could have grown the silicon on its own, but this is the luxury that we used to simply buy them. But yeah, the first step was pretty much to see whether we have any kind of good ohmic contact at low temperatures. At high temperatures, this is more or less easy. But at low temperatures, then you have to already think about what you're doing. Obviously, we are not the first ones in the community to actually do this. So we could rely on a lot of experimental work, which has been done in the past. So you start up with reading a lot of papers. But as soon as you actually start fabricating one, you will realize that it always depends on the details, and especially those details which are not written in a paper. So this is basically something you will learn immediately. And therefore, we started at reproducing what other people did and then finding our way to actually have induction at deep temperatures, in this case at 4K, because it doesn't really make sense to go to even lower temperatures.
Because things don't change anymore.
No, not really. Not in a way that we can measure this at an ohmic contact. Yeah. And then we simply proceeded. At some point, we split it up to actually share the work among 2 PhD students. I focused especially on the gate structure on top. And the other PhD student basically focused on the fabrication of the or the structuring of this kind of silicon chip. Yeah. And then we went forward. That's what we did.
And how do you so if right now I guess there's a parallel track of the sort of academically fabricated quantum dots and the sort of more industry-like fabrication.
Yeah. So this was actually kind of a crazy moment at the beginning of this year. So that I read the paper which was published by Intel in cooperation with QTech in the Netherlands, that they actually fabricated a device, literally with the same kind of process I was pursuing. So at the moment, this is basically going in parallel with the industry. Obviously, the industry has the advantage that they do this already for quite some time, and they even earn money with it, so they do not have the problem that they lose their technology at some point. But yeah, at the moment we are trying to have more and more industry corporations in this case to actually transfer knowledge, to actually find people who can speak both languages, make this connection happen, and then proceed from there. Because at some point, obviously, you do not really want to spend all of your time as an academic group simply fabricating devices. You really want to proceed to have more than a few qubits and then go forward and do more physics and more cool measurements and experiments in the end.
So what is the day-to-day life in this like? So you spend a lot of time in the clean room. We already established this. And so how should somebody who doesn't know about this imagine the day-to-day life?
If I would simply wrap up a day during the high season of technology development, let's say, you get up early because in the very morning, most of the people are not necessarily working, especially not in a clean room. Obviously, you always have a lab buddy somewhere because otherwise you're not allowed to work there. And then you plan your experiments. In this case, I mean with experiments, the specific technological oriented experiments you have to do, because you obviously have some kind of black box in front of you. Let's say this is some kind of machine, and you actually want to learn how to come from something you put in there to something you actually can use, which gets out of this machine. And then you spend most of the day also sitting in front of the machine to actually figure out what is really going on. And in many times, this is also a little bit frustrating because obviously there is not one parameter which changes something, but like, I don't know, 10-ish, 20.
The hidden variable.
Yeah, it's always the problem that you should always be afraid of the things you don't know. And this can actually blow up every kind of scheduling you've done before. Either way, so the fun part always begins that as soon as you basically have a better or developed a good understanding of what is really going on, and this is obviously also something you can do up front, so the day before, let's say, and you really realize that you understood what is going on, and you can really proceed and see and tune basically the machine you have all the way to the maximum capabilities which are feasible. And then this is always kind of cool. Obviously, you leave the clean room in between because working longer than like 7 hours straight in a clean room is exhausting.
Yeah, I also heard this light can make you depressed, right? Because
it depends on the room you're in. If you're if you're in photolithography, let's say, then everything is like yellowish because it's very sensitive to the blue part. The rest is like white.
Yeah.
So you get used to it.
Yeah,
you
I
really
also
get used to it.
Also, there's this constant noise
The
from
humming.
the constant humming.
Yeah. But yeah, obviously you have to have some kind of endurance to really go forward in fabrication. I can't say anything against that. It's simply a fact.
I think the other thing that you really learn is to be present at the right moments, right? You have a lot of kind of boring and repetitive tasks, but if you lose your concentration at the wrong moment,
you have to
ruin
be
2 days of work.
Yeah, pretty much. So this is so you really have to stay focused, and it's always good to question everything up front. But during the time you're in there, you have to stay focused because otherwise you might, from the obvious parts that you might injure yourself or damage a machine, you really do not want to screw up your samples you fabricated beforehand because depending on what you're doing, they might have already seen a month of work. And it's always like, this is also a little bit a pity because in most cases, doing fabrication is something which is considered to which one should do. You simply have to do it at the beginning. To run an experiment, you have to do fabrication. But the pity is if you start something new in terms of fabrication and it's not yet developed as much as it needs to be developed to actually simply run, then it can be very exhausting.
I think the key to being a successful researcher in spin qubits is to be there when a device is working and ideally already in the fridge. This is the moment to arrive.
That's right? The most luxurious situation there is. Yeah.
Yes, because when things work, they usually work.
If they work, you do not have any problems, right? you can directly start tuning it, manipulating the qubit, but this is basically something. It's like the ideal situation in simulation, right?
Yeah.
It doesn't happen. It does happen. It does happen. But it's not the general case.
So did you in your time as during the PhD, did you supervise any master or bachelor students?
Yeah, quite many actually. So on a scale of like 6-ish in total.
Yeah, and like how many of them did do clean room projects and how many did non-clean room related projects?
Well, for bachelor thesis, I always relied on a project where I more or less knew what would come out, which are very limited, so there are no surprises. So they did simulation.
Yes, I have the same sort of philosophy. I also think that the clean room is very dangerous.
Yeah, it's like for sure. So for masters, I always try to make it. So all of them went into the clean room, obviously because I spend most of my time there. But they also had like very, let's say from a technological point of view, very easy projects. Yeah. I'd rather worked with the master students in a way that I wanted to build up something where I can actually characterize defects, as we already talked about, within the materials. And they were let's say the lucky ones, or the unlucky ones, depends on the perspective, I guess, who did even easier jobs or tasks in the clean room to actually then fabricate first devices. But if we are honest, this is also quite cool, because if you're in your master's and did a lot or heard a lot of lectures and calculated your exercise sheets and so on, then actually fabricating something on your own, even if it's a very, very tiny sample, or tiny in terms of effort you have to put in, it's already cool that you have basically the full range of creating a sample, measuring it, analyzing it, and getting something out.
How much time did you spend measuring compared to time in the clean room?
Oh, I definitely spend more time in a clean room, to be honest. So
I mean, it's not unusual.
No. It's like 2/3 in the clean room of the overall time, and 1/3 in measuring.
Yeah.
No. But I always try to automate things as much as possible, because this is basically gives you more time to do something else, obviously.
Yeah.
And therefore I ended up measuring already while still being in the clean room, because it was automated in a way that I do not really have to supervise.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the, to perfect the materials and processes, in principle, what you want is probably, I mean, eventually people need to do really a big effort in running the same tests on many, many devices to really improve the yield and performance, right?
Yeah, this is, it's always, in the very end, it's always about the statistics, right? If you read a paper, then in most of the cases, the paper is like one sample. If you want to improve the yield of the sample, or the number of statistical data points you have to have more samples and more measurements. And then this is basically something which is, and one has to be fair, still missing up to some degree.
Yeah, I think this is something that people always think that physics is very reproducible. And I think solid state physics is probably in most cases fairly reproducible, meaning that if you would cool down the same sample again, well, sometimes samples break, of course, so you couldn't do that. But let's say like the very sample that the experiment was measured on, it probably worked, and it probably did the thing that they
At
said.
least chances are high, right?
Chances are high. But I mean, most people don't publish papers where they did the same thing 10 times in a row. And sometimes they don't publish this because it wouldn't be so easy to do.
Yeah. That's also actually a pity, because this is also a big part of research, obviously, but it's not so, or it's not considered outstanding anymore. And this is basically something which is always a little bit,
maybe
unfortunate, let's say, because you always only see the very best side of a sample or of a group or of whatever they did. But that's how it is, right?
I also have to say, like, from my PhD work, sometimes you look at some papers from other groups, or some, and of course the paper that ends up in Science or Nature is like many people who did hard work, but it's also sometimes a lucky device. Like there's a lot of hero qubits, meaning that there's this one qubit that somebody made that is really, really good. Yeah. And often in such a way that they don't really know what made this qubit super good.
Yeah.
This can be somewhat depressing. And I think it's good to remember this, that in the beginning, at least in many of the qubits, in the beginning, there's a lot of devices that are outstanding. But what you don't see in the journal is the 10 devices before that were crap.
Yeah. If it's only 10.
Yes, if it's only 10, exactly.
Can be arbitrarily higher.
Yes, exactly. Let's talk a little. Maybe let's take a little bit of an intermission with some rapid either or questions, just to
I heard of this.
To be a bit more.
I was looking forward to this.
To relax things a little bit. So let's start with gallium arsenide or silicon.
Silicon,
of course.
Obviously.
Theory or experiment.
Experiment.
And measuring or fabrication. What do you enjoy more?
I enjoyed more fabrication, but I would like to go more into measuring. So
and I think it's always, you always enjoy the thing that you're not failing at right now.
I always want to do also new things and go forward, and therefore.
Do you prefer teaching, like being a TA, more, or mentoring, like mentoring a bachelor or master's student?
Mentoring. It's way more fun. Yeah. You're in more contact. It's
true that
I really like that.
Maybe we can just briefly I think also like people always say that we at the universities we could be better at teaching, and we probably could be, but it's also that for PhD students, I mean, teaching is not always the most enjoyable part of the job. Also for postdocs, I have to admit.
Yeah, I mean, teaching is something. So teaching without where we exclude supervision of master and bachelor students is obviously something which is reasonable to do. I mean, right? That's how it works, and one has to do this because otherwise you do not get any students to do or have the fundamental basis. But supervision makes way more fun. It's also, if you think about your project, if you teach somebody how to solve the Schrödinger equation in an exercise, it is related to your work, but it doesn't bring you forward necessarily. While working with a master student who can actually develop the creativity, or might even have already the creativity to bring in new ideas and new thoughts and also work towards a specific goal, this is way more fun.
Yeah, maybe there's some way in the future. I think the other problem is that in teaching we have to always correct homeworks, and then don't. I mean, it's not a thankful task.
No, it takes a lot of time, at least a day, Yeah. Depending, when you're lucky, then it's a day.
Yeah, exactly.
Can be even more. And then in addition,
and you don't see the result. Maybe the students learn something. Maybe you see it in the next exercise. But exactly, like if you have a master student, maybe at some point he does something that you didn't come up with yourself.
Yeah.
And true. Much more rewarding.
Yeah. But on the other hand, I mean, from within the last couple of years, at some point I realized that somehow the basis for understanding, for example, quantum mechanics, is becomes a little bit more hard, because you actually realize that people have heard or learned less before actually starting to study. So this is actually also up to some degree fascinating, even though it's negatively connotated, I would say. There I'm always eager to actually teach them something that they actually can make or are able to make up this kind of gap, which is building up. But yeah.
So in scaling up the quantum dots, how much of the improvement of these devices will be improving material science, and how much of it will be improving the architecture, like sort of the material, or how you use the material?
Good question. I would say it's in the next steps, it's definitely improving the materials. I think that we learned sufficiently, or we had a decent number of experiments to prove that these kind of concepts we are following and we are doing research on work. But most of the time, I would always say that the materials itself seem to be a limiting factor. Being it the heterostructure, so the silicon basis or the silicon germanium, or even gallium arsenide, even though it might be cleaner or better in terms of material quality. But there are so many different problems which arise as soon as you simply put two materials on top of each other, which can end up in a huge mess. I would definitely say going towards material quality and improvements is the next step we have to do.
And should the community spend more time on making more quantum dots or making better quantum dots? Or do both at the same time?
Also a fascinating question. So Rami Barens, who just recently joined the research center, basically answered this question in the sense that it's good that you simply scale up the number of qubits. The question is whether you can use them for anything, or, as I understood, he would rather follow the direction of improving the qubits up to a degree that you can actually rely on longer and better performances, even though you just have a few. And I would actually say that currently I would make them better. So basically equivalent to what he said. But on a long time scale, you should definitely make sure that you also have a decent amount or a decent amount of qubits.
Regarding materials, what's the better material, sapphire or silicon dioxide? So let's say aluminum oxide, like amorphous aluminum oxide or silicon dioxide.
It's silicon oxide. Yeah.
Oh, silicon oxide is the better dielectric.
Definitely.
And why?
Oh, multiple reasons. So aluminum oxide has, so from the capabilities of what we are able to do to actually create aluminum oxide, the dominant way is using atomic layer deposition. And this basically relies on metal organic precursors, which are then oxidized in this case. And these kind of technology processes are very much prone to being all over the place. Especially if you think about thin layers, then we are deviating from the ideal aluminum oxide, which everybody's referring to drastically in all respects. And therefore, silicon oxide is basically one of the best or let's say investigated materials we have. If you have thin layers, it even ends up with the equivalent capacitive coupling, which is important later on. And we can actually improve it by using passivation techniques, for example. And this is not the case for aluminum oxide.
Should maybe a last quick question: should quantum dots live at millikelvin temperatures or at 1 Kelvin?
I mean, there are groups who are doing this at 1 Kelvin. I would say it doesn't matter as long as they live long enough and have a decent performance in the very end.
Maybe another lighthearted question, because I did my master's thesis in the same group. Do you guys still play computer games in the lunch break?
Yes, we do.
Very good. How does the research cluster ML4Q influence the life of a PhD student?
There's more communication between groups, actually. So beforehand, it always felt like a one group activity up to some degree. And the cluster actually changed that you actually have more contacts to different physicists and engineers from different disciplines with different kind of backgrounds. You have to learn the language before, because otherwise you're lost again and you're standing there on your own. But as soon as this is done, you can actually use the cluster as a huge resource.
Yeah, I think so too. I mean, part of it is us talking right now. But
yeah, exactly.
I think indeed it's a really cool way to. I mean, for me, it's also always amazing to talk to other scientists and learn what they're up to.
It's always fun. I mean, being on a podcast show is something I wouldn't have imagined a few years ago. But yeah, it's quite fun.
You have also worked on an outreach project making an image movie, right?
Yeah. This was also related. So at some point, our institute realized that simply doing whatever we are doing for the next couple of years doesn't really solve a few problems. And in this case, one of these problems is basically that we want to grow. We have so many projects here, and people have to know us or get to know us. And therefore, one of the ideas was basically that we develop or that we create an image film of our institute. And apparently I was too motivated when I heard about this and had too many ideas that I ended up sketching it and then also producing it together with a film team.
That's really, I mean, I think always that doing other things than science during a PhD is always a good idea. Because you get back to the work with more motivation afterwards. Yeah. And maybe you motivate some students to join, and that's really, I think, maybe one of the most important things that we can do, right?
Yeah, definitely. So if people are interested, they should simply go to YouTube, search for our institute, so the JARA Institute for Quantum Information, and they will immediately find our image film.
Okay. So
and if they have like 2.5 minutes, then they know what we are doing and what we are heading.
Should we do more in terms of outreach as a quantum community here in the Rhineland, or?
Definitely. I mean, in comparison to Bavaria or what do they call this? Lower Saxony. Nobody really knows something about us. So in comparison to them, I don't have the feeling that we are doing enough. I mean, we're a huge project and a huge collaboration between different universities with like all kinds of expertise. And nobody really knows. So at least this is my impression. It might have changed already, but yeah.
Yes, I mean the millions of people listening to this podcast might disagree, but
they might disagree. Yeah.
Then let's maybe briefly talk for the end about a little bit about still the future of quantum and your future here. So what do you think will be? Do you think the silicon germanium material with like little tweaks and help from industry is a really good candidate to scale up for like these near-term intermediate scale quantum computers?
So for these NISQ devices, I think that we are too far behind. At the moment, they are like the ion trap platform. We have photonic approaches, and then obviously there are these decent approaches by IBM with the superconducting qubits. So I don't think that we will actually end up fabricating something or silicon-based electron spin qubits will end up as a NISQ device. So I guess silicon germanium will rather go for the long haul and then come back with a huge amount of qubits, which are in the end error corrected, and you can use whatever you want to do. If they know by then what they want to do.
So you will probably start, or have you started writing yet, or you will start writing a thesis soon?
I basically just started, so I'm preparing all the figures now, and then.
So how do you plan on the writing process? What's your
So my take on this is that I start with the figures, then iterate this before to actually make sure that nobody finds a new or way of telling me that it's that I should start doing something more, and then starting to write text.
Yeah,
that does
That's
answer your
reasonable.
question.
Because in science we often just the text is just describing the diagrams and the pictures in more words.
Kind of, and I think you really don't want to end up in a situation where you wrote your thesis independently of master or PhD, whatever, and then 2 weeks before you actually wanted to hand in the thesis, somebody tells you, or your supervisor tells you, no, not like this. You should better remap things, reorder them, and that does happen in the writing process of papers sometimes. And it can also happen in a thesis.
I also have
something what you really want to try to circumvent.
I also have to admit that I probably take at least a day per figure in the thesis, and you usually have quite a few figures, so it's a lot.
And it takes a huge amount of time. I wouldn't have imagined that. So within the last week, I basically prepared like 3 figures, because obviously as a PhD, you work for longer than only 1 year. So like in this case, 5 years, and you really have to boil it down, and obviously you're not creating all the figures only within the last quarter. So you have to reevaluate and reanalyze up to some degree the past 5 years, and this is a huge amount of work.
Yeah.
So this is
what advice would you give yourself if you could talk to yourself at the start of the PhD?
Oh boy, try to find a sample in the first place. start measuring right away. Yeah.
But I mean, you didn't say you should take better notes and order stuff better, which would have been my advice to my former self.
Yeah.
So you're more organized than I was.
I guess I guess I am organized. I actually had 3 different approaches on how to save progress and data and results I had, write down the hypothesis and then try to falsify it and so on. But the only problem is that every time I did this, at some point I realized that my system doesn't work anymore due to whatever reason. And therefore I had to change the system. And then I missed to actually make sure that everything is is coherent between the systems. And now I had to rethink and re-understand how I wrote things down. And then this also depends on where you store data, what kind of data you store.
I also always find this interesting.
Yeah.
You have to think that you yourself 2 months later are already a different person.
Yeah, completely. One good advice for everybody, write down everything you can think of. So the metadata, it's always the metadata. It's the most important one. And if you think it's not important, you're wrong.
Yes.
Write it down. Especially in terms of like where you can simply write or create a TXT file, which is on a scale of like a kilobyte.
Yeah, you put next to an image where you write, this is what I took the image
simply write
of.
it out. Take that 1 minute, right? So I have like, I don't know.
I also think this is very good advice to students because this moment of starting to write your thesis is probably one of the most vulnerable points in the history of a PhD.
Kind of.
And it's an exciting time, but I think everybody at that point runs into some issues. It's normal, but indeed, some people are better organized than other people and have it easier.
Yeah, and it's the most painful moment when you realize that you should have written something down and you simply can't remember what you thought you might remember 5 years ago. This is like, and simply doesn't work.
then what are your plans after the PhD? Maybe as in like closing question.
I've always been interested in semiconductor industry, so I could imagine that I switch towards industry. I also always had a drive to understand how industry and markets work. And therefore, I could imagine doing this.
I hear Oregon is nice in the summer, right? I hear Oregon is nice in the summer.
That's true. That's true.
People say.
So people say, and they even fabricate cool samples.
Yes,
which came out at the beginning of this year.
So indeed, I mean, you are lucky in the sense that industry is doing what you are doing for your PhD now. So there is definitely industry options.
I guess so. Yeah. I don't want to rule out that I stay in academia for a little bit longer, but then it obviously should be interesting. Should be interesting again is a harsh statement, but I'm always eager to develop myself and learn something new. So it should definitely have some kind of change in terms of tasks here.
All right, then thank you for sharing some of your PhD history and all these insights on the future of silicon spin qubit quantum computers.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.